For 19 years he had been loyal. For 19 years he had protected his family, but when he grew old and weak, they abandoned him like an old piece of furniture, and now in a cold shelter, Duke had lost all hope. No one wanted an aging German shepherd. No one even looked at him. But then a woman walked in and everything changed. Stay with us because this story will break your heart and put it back together again. The cold air seeped through the thin walls of the Montana Haven Animal Shelter, carrying the sound of barking dogs and the faint whimper of those who had given up among them. Duke lay curled up in the back of his cage, his once powerful frame reduced to a fragile shadow of itself. His fur, once thick and golden, was now graying patchy and matted. His legs trembled even when he stood. But Duke didn't stand much anymore. He had been here for 6 months. 6 months of people passing by, their eyes lighting up at puppies, at strong young dogs, but never at him. No one wanted the 19-year-old German shepherd with cloudy eyes and weak bones. Poor guy, whispered Emma, a young shelter volunteer, as she refilled Duke's water bowl. He barely drinks anymore. Greg, the shelter owner, stood nearby, arms crossed, watching Duke with sad eyes. We've tried everything. He stopped eating the moment he realized his family wasn't coming back for him. He sighed. He's just waiting. And I don't know if he's waiting for a home or just waiting to give up. Duke's ears flicked at the sound of their voices, but he didn't lift his head. He had stopped caring until she walked in. Sarah Bennett wasn't here to adopt a dog. She hadn't stepped foot in the shelter in over a year. The last time she had been here, she was with her husband, Jake. They used to volunteer together, spending weekends walking the abandoned dogs. Then Jake got sick, and in what felt like the blink of an eye, he was gone. Sarah had shut the door on so many things after his death, but today something had pulled her back. Maybe it was the silence in her house, maybe it was the ache in her chest that never quite went away, or maybe it was fate. She walked past rows of eager dogs, young tail wagging, barking happily for attention. But then her eyes fell on a cage in the farthest corner. She stopped inside. Lay a German shepherd, unlike any she had ever seen. He didn't move, he didn't bark, he didn't even look up. A chill ran through her. Something about the way he lay there, so still, so resigned, felt painfully familiar, like she was looking into a mirror. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg and Emma exchanged chid glances. "That's Duke," Greg said softly. "He's been here 6 months. He's old. Sarah, really old." Sarah took a step closer, kneeling beside the cage. "How did he end up here?" Greg exhaled. "His family brought him in. Said he was too old, that they didn't have the time to deal with him anymore." His voice hardened with anger. 19 years. Sarah, 19 years he was theirs, and they just left him. Sarah's breath caught. 19 years. The weight of those words settled deep inside her. How could someone do that? How could anyone throw away something they had loved for so long? Her fingers gripped the cold metal bars. "Does he ever respond?" Emma shook her head. "Not really. He barely eats, doesn't react to people. It's like he's already gone." Sarah's heart clenched. She looked back at Duke. His ribs rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths. His ears were scarred from time. His body, once strong, looked exhausted. But it wasn't just his body that was tired. It was his soul. She had seen that look before in herself. Without another word, Sarah unlatched the cage door and stepped inside Duke. She whispered nothing. She reached out, hand hovering just above his dull fur. "Duke, look at me." The old shepherd stirred slightly, and for the first time, his cloudy brown eyes met hers. A single moment passed between them, a moment that would change both of their lives forever. Duke's eyes met Sarah's for just a second, just long enough for her to see it. Pain, confusion, loss. Then just as quickly, the old shepherd's gaze drifted away back to nothingness. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. Most shelter dogs reacted when someone stepped into their cage. Some wagged their tails, some barked excitedly, some even cowered, but Duke did nothing. He had given up. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the metal bars of the kennel. "Sarah, don't get your hopes up," Greg said softly from behind her. "He's not like the others." She glanced back at him. "What do you mean?" Greg sighed and ran a hand over his beard. "We've had older dogs before. Some come in, scared, some aggressive, some depressed. But Duke," he hesitated. "Duke's empty. We don't know if it's because of his age or because of what happened to him before he got here." Sarah turned back to the frail German shepherd. 19 years, that was a lifetime. Most dogs didn't live that long, and for those that did, it was rare for them to end up alone in a shelter, discarded like an afterthought. She took a slow breath. "He wasn't always like this," she murmured. Emma, the young volunteer, perked up. "What do you mean?" Sarah reached out tentatively, letting her hand hover inches from Duke's fur. "I don't know much about shepherds, but I know dogs, and no dog makes it to 19 without someone loving him first. No dog survives that long without fighting to live." Emma bit her lip, looking at Duke sadly. "So what happened to him?" Greg crossed his arms. "We only know what his owners told us, and honestly, I don't trust a word of it." Sarah frowned. "What did they say?" Greg exhaled sharply that he was just a family pet, that he was slowing down, that they didn't have time to care for an old dog anymore. His jaw tightened. They made him sound like an inconvenience, not like a best friend, not like a dog who had given them his entire life. Sarah's stomach twisted. She turned back to Duke. "Did they say how long they had him?" Greg hesitated, then with a grim nod, he said, "Since he was a puppy," Sarah's breath caught, "they had him for 19 years. 19 years. And they still walked away." A wave of emotions crashed over her. Anger, disbelief, sadness. But the worst was the understanding, because she had lost someone too. And that kind of loss changed a person. Or in Duke's case, it changed a dog. Sarah's hand inched closer. "Duke," she whispered again. The old shepherd stirred slightly, his ears twitching. But still he didn't look at her. She could feel Greg and Emma watching. "Don't take it personally," Greg said softly. "He doesn't respond to anyone." Sarah swallowed. "Did anyone try adopting him?" Emma looked away. Greg sighed. "A couple of people looked at him, but when they saw how old he was, how sick he looked," he shook his head. "No one wants to bring home a dog just to watch him die." Silence fell over the room. Sarah's chest ached. She had come here with no intention of adopting a dog. She had barely been able to take care of herself the past 2 years, let alone another life. But as she sat there looking at Duke, she knew one thing for sure. He didn't deserve to die in this place, not like this. She took a deep breath. "I'll take him," she said. Emma's head snapped up. "Wait, really?" Greg frowned. "Sarah, are you sure I'll take him?" she repeated, firmer this time. Greg hesitated, then he glanced at Duke. He might not even make it through the night. He warned he hasn't eaten properly in weeks. Sarah's heart clenched, but she lifted her chin. Then at least he won't spend his last night alone. A beat of silence. Then Greg nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll get the paperwork." Sarah turned back to Duke, reaching out once more. This time she let her fingers graze the fur on his back. It was coarse, brittle, and Duke flinched. Sarah's breath hitched, not in pain, not in surprise, but in fear. Her stomach dropped. What had this dog been through the drive home was silent. Duke lay curled in the back seat, motionless. His body, frail yet dignified, barely shifted with the bumps in the road. Sarah kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, searching for signs of discomfort. Fear anything but Duke gave her nothing. She exhaled softly, tightening her grip on the wheel. What had she just done? Taking him had been an impulsive decision driven by instinct and something deeper, something she still wasn't ready to name, but now reality was sinking in. Could she really take care of an old dog who had given up on life when she pulled into her doctor driveway? The wind howled through the Montana, night carrying whispers of winter's approach. The sky was dark, the air crisp. Sarah stepped out of the car and opened the back door. "Duke," she said gently. Nothing. He didn't move. Her chest tightened. Was he asleep, was he? Panic shot through her as she crouched down and touched his fur. Warm he was breathing. She let out a shaky exhale and reached under him, her arms trembling slightly. "Elle," as she lifted his fragile body. Duke didn't resist, didn't react. He was just there like a ghost of what he used to be. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and carried him inside. Her house was quiet. Too quiet the last time she had walked through this door with a life depending on her. It had been Jake, and she had lost him, but this was different. Duke wasn't Jake. Duke still had a chance. She set him down gently on a large dog bed near the fireplace. Her heart pounding, he curled up stiff and slow and let out a heavy breath. She knelt beside him, brushing her fingers through his brittle fur. "You're home, Duke," she whispered. "I promise." He didn't lift his head, didn't acknowledge her. Sarah sighed and stood. She had expected that she walked to the kitchen, filling a bowl with warm broth-soaked kibble. If he wouldn't eat solid food, maybe he'd take this. She placed it in front of him. Nothing. Sarah bit her lip. "Come on, buddy," she coaxed, nudging the bowl slightly, just a little. Duke blinked sluggishly, but didn't even sniff it. Her chest tightened. What had they done to you? She grabbed a soft blanket and draped it over him. He didn't flinch. This time progress, or maybe he was just too tired to care. Sarah sat down on the couch watching him. Minutes passed, then an hour, then two. Still Duke Barr barely moved. She leaned her head back, exhaustion creeping in. She hadn't felt this drained in a long time. Her eyelids grew heavy. The last thing she saw before sleep pulled her under was Duke lying still, his eyes open, staring at something unseen. A sound woke her. Sarah's eyes snapped open. The house was dark, the fire reduced to embers, and Duke was gone. Her breath caught. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Duke, silence!" She pushed off the couch, her feet hitting the cold wooden floor. Her pulse roared in her ears as she searched the dimly lit room. Then she saw him. He stood in the hallway, rigid as a statue. His cloudy eyes were locked on something. Sarah followed his gaze and froze. Duke was staring at a picture on the wall, a picture of Jake. Sarah's stomach flipped. She took a slow step forward. Duke, his ears twitched. His eyes remained locked on the photo, and then, in the silence of the house, he did something she never expected. He let out a low, broken whimper. Sarah's breath hitched. Duke hadn't made a sound since she met him, but now, looking at her late husband's face, something had stirred inside him, something deep, something painful, something Sarah wasn't ready to understand. Duke's whimper hung in the silence, fragile and broken like something long buried, clawing its way to the surface. And Sarah stood, frozen, her eyes shifting between the old German shepherd and the picture of Jake on the wall. Why was Duke reacting like this? For days he had been nothing but a shadow, unresponsive, emotionless. But now he was staring at a man he had never met, making a sound of recognition. Sarah's chest tightened. She took a hesitant step forward, keeping her voice gentle. "Duke, what is it?" The old shepherd flicked his ears but didn't turn toward her. His cloudy eyes remained locked on the photograph. His body eerily still. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. This wasn't normal. Duke had never even looked her in the eyes before yet. Here he was, transfixed, his tired body tense, as if remembering something long forgotten. Sarah reached out, slowly resting her palm on his back. He didn't flinch this time, progress, but he also didn't relax. His breath was uneven, his chest rising and falling in slow, strained movements. Sarah swallowed hard. "Come on, Duke, let's get you back to bed." For a long moment he didn't move. Then finally, with a sluggish blink, He broke his gaze away from Jake's picture, and just like that, the moment was gone. Sarah led him back to his bed by the fireplace. Her mind racing. Had he known someone like Jake before? Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something she wasn't seeing? The next morning, Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet crackling of embers in the fireplace. She sat up, groggy, rubbing her temples. Duke lay in his bed awake, not just awake, watching her. Sarah's breath caught for the first time since she had brought him home. His eyes weren't dull and empty. They weren't full of life either, but they were there. Present morning. "Buddy," she said softly. Duke blinked. Sarah hesitated, then decided to test something. She stood up and walked toward the kitchen. She didn't call him, didn't make a sound, but after a moment she heard it, the soft shuffle of paws on the hardwood floor. Her heart skipped. She turned, and there he was. Duke had followed her. It was small, almost nothing, but after everything it felt like the beginning of something. Sarah knelt, grabbing a bowl and filling it with food. Duke stood a few feet away watching. "I know you don't trust me yet," she murmured, stirring warm broth over the kibble. "But we're getting there, aren't we?" She set the bowl down. Duke stared at it. Sarah held her breath. Seconds passed and then Duke lowered his head and took his first bite. Sarah exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and something dangerously close to hope swelling in her chest. He wasn't just surviving, he was trying. As the days passed, Duke's walls began to crack. Just a little. He still slept most of the time. He still barely acknowledged her, but he followed her now whenever she moved from one room to another. He would trail behind her, never close, never touching, but watching. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it meant something. One evening, Sarah sat on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, flipping through old photos. Duke lay nearby, his head resting on his paws. She smiled sadly as she traced her fingers over an image of Jake holding a puppy. It had been taken years ago, back when they had first talked about adopting a dog, back before hospitals, before grief, before loss. Sarah sighed and set the picture down. She glanced at Duke. "I think you would have liked him," she whispered. Duke lifted his head. Sarah blinked in surprise. He had reacted something about her words. He had understood. Her pulse quickened. "Who were you before they left you?" She had to know, she had to find out, and something deep inside told her that when she did, it would change everything. Duke was changing. It was slow. So slow that anyone else might not have noticed, but Sarah did. He ate now, not much, but enough. He followed her around the house, watching her like he was trying to understand her, and sometimes late at night when the house was silent, he would let out a quiet sigh, a sound that felt like the weight of a lifetime settling into his old bones. Sarah knew that feeling. Well, loss did that to you, but what had Duke lost? And more importantly, who had he been before they threw him away? She had to know the next morning. Sarah made a decision. She grabbed her car keys and headed out this time, not to the shelter, but to the people who had abandoned him. She had Greg's records. She knew their names. She wasn't looking for a confrontation. She just wanted answers. The house was larger than she expected. A 2-story home with a wraparound porch, a perfectly trimmed lawn, and a luxury car in the driveway. This wasn't some struggling family who had been forced to give up their dog. No, they had simply chosen to. Sarah clenched her jaw and knocked on the door. A woman in her early 60s answered, dressed in a pressed cardigan and pearls. She had the kind of face that had never known hardship. She blinked at Sarah, frowning. "Can I help you?" Sarah took a steady breath. "Hi, my name is Sarah Bennett. I adopted Duke." The woman's face remained blank. Sarah felt something inside her tighten. "You're a dog, the one you left at the shelter." For a long moment the woman said nothing. Then, with an unbothered sigh, she shook her head. "Oh, him. Him, not Duke, not our dog, just him. Sarah's hands curled into fists. "I was hoping you could tell me about his past," she said, keeping her voice level. I want to understand where he came from." The woman pursed her lips. "We had him for a long time, but he was getting old. Slowing down, it wasn't fair to keep him." Sarah's stomach twisted. "So you abandoned him?" The woman didn't even flinch. "We gave him a chance to be adopted by someone else," Sarah saw. He's 19, she snapped. "No one was going to adopt him. You knew that." The woman crossed her arms. "Why are you here?" Sarah exhaled sharply. "Because Duke isn't just any dog. There's something about him, something I don't understand, and I think it has to do with his past." The woman hesitated just for a second. Sarah caught it. "You know something, don't you?" For the first time, the woman looked uncomfortable. Then she sighed. "You should talk to my husband." He was already waiting for them in the living room, a tall man in his 60s, grey-haired, with a face carved by time and regret. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. When Sarah introduced herself, "So you have him now," he murmured. Sarah's pulse quickened. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "He wasn't supposed to be ours." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" The man exhaled, rubbing his temples. "We didn't get him as a pet. He was a working dog, a partner." Sarah breath caught a partner. The man met her gaze. "He was a canine, my canine." Sarah stared, the world tilted. "You were a cop?" she asked. He nodded. "Retired now, but Duke wasn't always Duke. Back then he was Shadow, and he wasn't just a good dog, he was the best." Sarah's pulse roared in her ears. She had known Duke was different. She had felt it from the start, but a Kate hanging that explained everything. The discipline, the watchfulness, the way he understood things even without being told, and the way he had reacted to Jake's picture. Her throat tightened. "Why didn't you tell the shelter?" The man's face darkened. "Because it didn't matter he was old. No one would want him." Once they saw that Sarah's jaw clenched. "But he wasn't just a pet to you. He was your partner. He would have died for you." The man looked away. "I know." Sarah took a sharp breath. "So why did you abandon him?" His hands curled into fists. "Because I couldn't watch him die." Silence. A heavy, awful silence. Sarah felt something inside her crack. "He gave you everything and you just walked away." The man's expression twisted, a mixture of shame and something else. "He wasn't himself anymore," he said quietly. He started getting confused, started forgetting commands. His legs weren't strong. It hurt to see him like that. He wasn't the dog I knew anymore. Sarah's stomach churned. "That's not a reason to throw him away," she whispered. The man flinched. Sarah had heard enough. She turned sharply, heading for the door. "Wait," the man called. She stopped. Is he still fighting?" he asked. Sarah exhaled shakily, and then in a voice laced with unbreakable certainty, she answered yes. And then she walked out. But as she reached her car, something else hit her, something she hadn't even thought about until now. Duke had been trained. That meant he had a past, a history, and possibly an unfinished mission. The drive home was a blur. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her heart pounding. Aki and Duke hadn't just been a pet. He had been a partner, a protector, a warrior.